There seems to be no end in sight for the Ukraine war as Vladimir Putin continues to order his forces to throw their bodies against Ukraine's defenses. Thousands of Russian soldiers are dying every month thanks to their president. And yet, Putin doesn't realize that he's simply forcing his country to descend deeper into a war that he's already lost. Russia failed to do what it set out to do, and thanks to Putin, the country has suffered a strategic defeat that has massive ramifications for Russia, both inside and outside of Ukraine. A NATO Admiral explains why Putin has already lost the war in Ukraine. That Admiral is Giuseppe Cavo Dragone, who has served as the chair of NATO's military committee since January 2025. Speaking to the BBC on November 2nd, Dragone said, "From an operational point of view, the war between Russia and Ukraine has become so bogged down that it was almost time to sit and talk because it's a waste of lives." Putin's attritional strategy, which was supposed to wear Ukraine down over time so that Russia could take the entire country, has backfired. Instead, Russia finds itself mired in a quagmire of its own creation. The numbers show us that Dragone is right. When it comes to lost troops and equipment, Russia is bleeding itself dry to sustain Putin's supposed special military operation. According to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, over 1.14 million Russian troops have been killed, injured, or captured between the beginning of the invasion and November 4th. Russia doesn't fare any better on the equipment front. More than 11,300 tanks are destroyed, damaged, or otherwise rendered unusable by Russia. The same goes for around 34,250 of Russia's armored vehicles and over 66,500 of its cars and cisterns, the ministry says. On the aerial front, Russia is struggling both offensively and defensively. Around 1,200 of its anti-aircraft warfare units lie in tatters. 428 Russian planes and 346 of the country's helicopters have been destroyed, and Russia has also lost a staggering 77,860 unmanned aerial vehicles to Ukraine's defenses. This isn't just a war that's bogging Russia down in terms of losing military strength, it's a war that's costing Russia far too much money. We'll come back to that point in a moment. First, what we see in all of these figures is a Russian president who is losing control of the war that he started. That's according to the National Security Journal, which says that Putin's creation of deathnomics inside Russia has become a weakness for Ukraine to exploit. This term, which was coined by a Russian economist named Vladislav Inozemtsev, is used to describe a so-called artificial middle class that's being created inside Russia. That artificial class is using the Ukraine war to generate income that it would otherwise have never received. Mothers and wives sometimes encourage loved sons to sign up rather than fall into unemployment or alcoholism, as death payments and battlefield wages can enrich a family. Over time, many Russians become comfortable with the war's costs, the journal writes. However, the scale of Russia's losses now means that comfortable is no longer the word that anybody would use for those who enriched themselves thanks to Ukraine. Whatever pride that may have existed from sending a relative to war to earn more money than a family had ever seen is being replaced by fear. Too many are dying, and as Russia becomes ever more bogged down in Ukraine, as Dragone points out that it is, the country's military weakens to the point where Ukraine can also carry out aerial strikes inside Russian territory. Targeting oil refineries and energy infrastructure, Ukraine is making Russia feel the pain by causing fuel shortages and skyrocketing fuel prices, in addition to killing so many of Russia's men. But the cost of being so bogged down for Russia is far higher than even these numbers reveal. We touched on the economic burden to Russia earlier. In February, Russia Matters highlighted the financial cost of 3 years of war that Putin never anticipated. Sanctions have crippled Russia's economy, with around $340 billion in frozen reserves adding to the loss of $78.5 billion in losses for Russia's energy sector after 3 years of fighting. Over 460 companies have exited Russia as a result of the war, which has dealt another economic blow. And after inflated growth caused by Putin transforming Russia's economy into one that operates on a war footing, Russia's economic growth is on the decline. World Economic Outlook estimates growth to slow to 1.4% in 2025, followed by 1.2% in 2026, according to Russia Matters. It might be even worse than that. On October 30th, the Moscow Times reported that Russia has recorded its third straight quarter of economic growth slowdown. The first 9 months of 2025 have seen Russia's economy expand by just 1%, which is over 4 times slower than the same period in 2024. All of this is happening because of how bogged down Russia has become in Ukraine. This special military operation was never meant to be a multi-year war for Russia. For Putin, this invasion should have been easy work. Back in 2014, The Guardian reported that Putin had claimed that Russia could conquer all of Ukraine in just 2 weeks if it wanted to. Fast forward over a decade later, and 2 weeks have become almost 4 years and counting. As Dragone says, Russia will have to negotiate sooner or later. The only barrier to that is Putin himself. The seeming inability of Russia's leader to recognize the true cost of many of his strategic mistakes inside Ukraine means that Putin will resist negotiating for as long as he is able. At least that's the opinion shared by a US intelligence assessment upon which NBC News reported on October 28th. That analysis concluded that the agencies involved in creating it see no sign that Putin is prepared to compromise on any of the demands he had made for a peace deal in Ukraine. NBC also noted that a senior US official and a senior congressional official both feel that Putin is more dug in than ever. So are his military and Russia's economy. That's why the former is losing thousands of soldiers and pieces of equipment per month, while the latter is bleeding billions of dollars. Putin's strategic mistake in Ukraine appears to be a combination of stubbornness and an unwavering belief in the strength of a military that has proven itself to be anything but capable of achieving Putin's objectives. Russia's leader is bleeding his country dry of people and money to get what he wants in Ukraine. Even if Russia succeeds, the sheer cost wrought by Ukraine in a loss will be enough to make Russia weaker than it should be for years, perhaps even decades to come. That covers Putin's strategic mistakes inside Ukraine and their results. However, perhaps even more worrying for Russia is what Putin's invasion has led to outside of Ukraine. As a direct result of Putin's actions, NATO is stronger than ever. That's the exact opposite of what Putin wanted to achieve. As the Journal of Democracy noted back in April 2022, one of Putin's goals with the war was to prevent NATO expansion towards Russian territory. But as Dragone points out, all Putin has really achieved is a combination of failure in Ukraine and the very expansion that he wanted to resist. Both Sweden and Finland have joined NATO as a direct response to Russia's actions in Ukraine, which in itself is a sign that Putin made a severe strategic mistake. According to USNI News, the addition of Sweden to NATO is a particular problem for Russia. With Sweden, NATO is now able to create much stronger defenses in the Nordic region of the Baltic Sea. The outlet notes that Sweden delivers over 100 years of experience in operating submarines in that very sea, which will allow NATO to patrol the doorway to Russia's massive St. Petersburg port. The addition of Sweden and Finland also allows NATO planners to finally cover what NATO planners once referred to as a white space in that waterway. What was once somewhat neutral territory close to Russia's borders has become a space that NATO defenses can fill. USNI News also quoted RAND's Marta Kepper, who told the outlet Sweden's most important contribution to NATO will be its territory for deterrence and defense purposes. Sweden can have an important role as an enabler and as a basing and staging area for US and allied forces. Sweden can help NATO prevent Russia's ability to shape the regional environment for a potential conflict and repel a Russian invasion. The Baltic Sea isn't quite a NATO lake, despite what some might claim, USNI News adds. It's a 145,000 square mile stretch of water, and NATO can't patrol it all. But the addition of 2 countries to NATO that maintain presences in the Baltic Sea and can allow NATO to reinforce its collective presence is bad news for Putin. And it only happened because of the Ukraine invasion. The addition of 2 new countries is far from the only way that NATO has strengthened. As the BBC reports, June saw all NATO members agree to increase their defense spending to 5% of their gross domestic products, or GDPs, by 2035. That move came amidst pressure from US President Donald Trump, who had previously suggested that NATO's non-US members needed to do more to pay their way in the alliance. Still, it was another outcome of the strategic mistakes Putin has made when it comes to NATO. The Ukraine war was supposed to weaken NATO's hold over Europe. Instead, it strengthened that hold. Putin pushed NATO into a corner, and it's come out swinging with new members, higher spending, more support for Ukraine, and as RBC Ukraine reported on November 3rd, a new plan to reinforce NATO's eastern flank with drones. By mid-2026, the outlet reports, NATO will essentially have a drone wall on its eastern flank to counter Russia's own drone threat. Again, we see NATO getting stronger in ways that it would never have needed to if Putin had just kept his country out of Ukraine. Still, Putin might think winning in Ukraine would solve these problems. NATO's expansion could be counteracted by Russian expansion, and with control over Ukraine, Putin might think that he could negotiate for sanctions to be dropped, enabling Russia's financial recovery. Sure, over 1 million and counting casualties isn't great for Russia in the future, but Putin might think that the millions of Ukrainians essentially added to Russia if he wins will take care of that problem. If that's what Putin believes, he's wrong, on so many levels. For one, Dragone tells the BBC, even a Russian victory in Ukraine won't mean that Putin gets to control the country. They will not get a friendly or puppet government like in Belarus. Putin will not succeed, Dragone claims. Perhaps that's what Putin doesn't understand. Though he has often framed his special military operation as a way to liberate the people of Ukraine from a supposedly tyrannical government, the reality is that most in Ukraine don't want Putin or any Russian puppets in their midst. We saw proof of that back in August. That's when the Kyiv Independent reported on a poll that quizzed Ukrainians on whether or not they would accept any of the proposed peace deals that existed at the time. Those deals included restrictions on Ukraine joining NATO, in addition to handing over control of 4 partially occupied regions of the country to Russia. Ukraine said no in massive numbers. A little over 3/4 of those polls said that they would reject such a peace deal. That's a slight decline from the 82% who said the same back in May, but it still shows that Ukraine has no appetite for any sort of Russian influence on the country's actions. As Dragone points out, this rejection of Russia's proposals shows that Ukraine will continue to fight tooth and nail to reject Russia, even if Putin's special military operation succeeds in taking all of Ukraine's territory. Putin won't have a nation that he can control. He won't get a population that is willing to boost Russia's flagging economy. The odds are that he will preside over a country filled with subterfuge, sabotage, and underground resistance long after a Russian victory in Ukraine. Yet another strategic mistake, then. Putin's belief that Ukraine wants Russian control is outright rejected by Ukraine itself. And this Ukrainian rejection will be supported by NATO and its European members, Dragone adds. The European nations that are supporting Ukraine's defense right now are prepared to keep going, Dragone tells the BBC. He adds that everything Putin has done in Ukraine has served as a wake-up call for Europe, that it cannot take Russia lightly. Instead, NATO has to strengthen, as it has done, and it needs to take a more aggressive tone when dealing with Russia's threats. That tone extends to the suggestions that Russia might use the nuclear option against Ukraine or NATO. On October 31st, the BBC reported that Russia has unveiled a pair of new nuclear weapons with which it hopes to threaten anybody who opposes it. One of those weapons, which was first discussed in 2018, is dubbed the Poseidon. This weapon can travel at speeds of up to 120 miles per hour while traveling in a constantly changing route that Russia claims makes it impossible to intercept. How true that can be for a weapon traveling at the speed of a drone in an era where supersonic and hypersonic nuclear missiles are preferred remains to be seen. Russia has also unveiled a nuclear-powered cruise missile named the Burevestnik. That weapon supposedly has an unlimited range, though again, it's never clear how much of the information that Russia provides about its weapons is accurate. Putin flaunts and threatens these nuclear weapons. But Dragone says that's another strategic mistake, because NATO can match Russia's nuclear arsenal. We are not threatened by them, he tells the BBC when discussing Russia's nuclear weapons. We are just ready to defend our 32 nations and our 1 billion people. We are a nuclear alliance. Dragone isn't wrong. The presence of the US in NATO means that the alliance has access to 5,044 nuclear weapons, per the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN. Russia has a few more than the US, with around 5,500, ICAN adds. However, the small shortfall is covered by 2 other NATO members, France and the UK. The Arms Control Association says that these 2 nations combined have 515 nuclear weapons. And thanks to its massive infrastructure, NATO is capable of launching these nukes from land, sea, or air. It would take far fewer than these massive collections of nukes to destroy all of the countries that might get involved in a conflict between Russia and NATO. But that's the point. Mutually assured destruction has always worked that way. Putin's strategic mistake here is believing that he can make credible nuclear threats against NATO when he knows that the alliance would devastate Russia just as badly as Russia hurts NATO's members. Threats that might have worked in the past only seem to be reinforcing the stronger responses that Russia is receiving from NATO due to the war. Putin unveils new nuclear weapons. Dragone points out that NATO is a nuclear alliance. Putin, so long used to being appeased when he throws Russia's nuclear weight around, is now being told flat out that NATO has what Russia has. There is no de-escalation here. Putin's bluff is being called, and Russia's president has no real response to that fact other than more useless saber-rattling. This is why Russia has lost the Ukraine war, whether it knows it or not. Yes, it's still possible that Russia could take all of Ukraine's territory. If it does, it will take many more years before that happens. In October, Reuters reported that Russia advancing at its current rate means it will have occupied 1% of Ukraine's total landmass between January and December 2025. That adds to the 19% it already occupied to give Putin 20% in just under 4 years. There's another 80% to go, and a rate of 1% of Ukraine per year means Putin would be long gone well before he realizes his goal of total control over Ukraine. That alone is a loss. Though Russia might still keep pushing, even when Putin is no longer president. If it does, it faces all of the problems we've highlighted already. Russia's economy is struggling. It's losing people at a rate of tens of thousands per month thanks to Putin's strategic incompetence. And looking through a wider lens shows us that Putin's desire to weaken NATO by limiting its expansion has gone unrealized. NATO has new members, and it's pumping more money into preparing for whatever Russia might have planned after Ukraine than ever before. And all of this is without mentioning that even a version of Ukraine that's ostensibly controlled by Russia will still never be Russian. Too many Ukrainians oppose the very concept of Russian rule for that to happen. Even if Putin wins in Ukraine, he still loses. For years, Russia has been building an empire. It hasn't always done it in the traditional sense. There had been the occasional invasion before the Ukraine war, but Vladimir Putin's preferred weapon of choice had usually been his country's influence. Backed by its military muscle and seemingly indomitable military status, Russia was able to extend its tendrils far and wide, from Belarus to the Middle East to Latin America. Putin had puppet regimes galore, but the myth of Russia's military might has been shattered in Ukraine, and the Russian Empire is paying the price. Putin's empire is crumbling as Russia's puppet regimes collapse around him. Right now, there is one country that showcases Russia's faltering influence more than any other: Venezuela. The country is feeling the heat at the moment as the United States is amassing ships and threatening to take out any vessels it deems a threat to US security, namely vessels believed to be associated with Venezuelan cartels and drug gangs. Terrified of the pressure the US is exerting on his country, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has gone calling on any country that he believes could help him. Russia is among those countries, as the Washington Post reported on October 31st. Maduro has reportedly written a letter to Putin requesting that Russia deliver defensive radars, aircraft repair equipment, and even missiles to Venezuela. And Putin has answered the call. To Russia's president, Venezuela's plight is a chance for Russia to extend its influence deeper into Latin America. By providing weapons now, Putin believes he will have Maduro on the hook for whatever he wants later. A puppet is created, or at least further controlled than he already was, as the Russian Empire expands. It's this sort of logic that has led to Putin sending a cargo plane to Caracas. It's unknown what this plane, which was a Russian Il-76, was carrying. However, Defense News notes that this aircraft can carry up to 50 tons of cargo, or 200 people. Small arms, military equipment, and mercenaries have all been delivered to Putin's puppet regimes using these planes in the past. It appears that the delivery to Venezuela included the latter at the very least. That's according to India's DD News, which claims that the types of planes Russia is sending to Venezuela are linked to Russia's Wagner Group. That raises the possibility of Wagner mercenaries, along with whatever equipment Putin chooses to send, operating inside Venezuela. On the surface, this all seems to be going by the Russian Empire expansion playbook. Putin identifies a country in desperate need of Russia's help. He then supplies that country with weapons and support, all of which he can use as leverage to turn that country into a puppet state for the Russian Federation. And indeed, as Jay in Kyiv points out in a November 2nd YouTube video, Maduro is desperate enough to give Putin almost anything he asks for in return for Russia's help. He called Putin. Putin sent in Wagner, Jay says. They came in and picked up like $150 million of Venezuela's central bank gold reserves. The Venezuelan state oil company moved the headquarters of its European location to Russia, giving Putin more control over the assets. This is pure desperation on Maduro's part. And as Jay notes, it's led to people in Venezuela being charged up to $70 per gallon for gasoline. Bear in mind that Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves at an estimated 303 billion barrels. It shouldn't be dealing with a gasoline crisis, yet Venezuela is facing exactly that, a gasoline crisis driven in part by Maduro's refusal to crack down on cartel operations and by Putin's attempts to extend Russian influence across Latin America. But by now you're probably asking yourself a question: what does any of this have to do with Putin's empire collapsing? If anything, the situation in Venezuela seems to showcase Putin doing what Russia has done for decades. Surely the empire is expanding rather than collapsing. But that isn't the case. While all of this looks like Russian business as usual on the surface, what Putin is doing for Venezuela isn't the display of power that he believes it to be. Russia is provoking the same country it assumed would quietly support, or at least not oppose it, when it began the invasion. Jay in Kyiv explains more. 2 massive planeloads of weapons to Maduro in a week only further assures Putin's fate, Jay says, revealing that a second plane has landed in Venezuela. Number 1, it pisses off Trump, while Trump's fingers are on the tomahawks, Jay says. He adds a second possible explanation for Putin's actions. Putin has no clue what's going on, or he's just suicidal. And this is a key point. Putin isn't just expanding Russia's influence here, as he has done many times in the past. By getting involved in the Venezuela situation, he is angering the US at a time when Trump is supporting Ukraine more than he has at any other point during his second term as president. And as we mentioned earlier, the US is preparing for a fight with Venezuela, or more accurately, it's getting ready to do battle against the country's drug gangs. On November 1st, Sky News reported that satellite images have shown US military ships running drills just 200 kilometers or about 124 miles off the Venezuelan coast. Those ships aren't operating so close to Venezuela's waters for no reason. They're there to present a threat to Maduro that will enable Trump to lean on him to get what he wants. Right now, the USS Iwo Jima and 2 other destroyers are operating in Caribbean waters that put them within touching distance, militarily speaking, of Venezuela. Sky News adds that the USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier has also been dispatched to the same region and will bring a further 3 destroyers along with it. Putin's decision to help Venezuela now isn't just him thumbing the Russian nose at the US. He's poking that nose right into America's business, which is almost certain to hurt any chances Putin has of achieving the type of peace he wants out of the Ukraine war. Speaking of Ukraine, Putin's desperation to demonstrate that Russia still presents a multi-continent geopolitical threat has ramifications for Russia's war effort. After all, Putin needs as many weapons as he can muster to maintain pressure on Ukraine in a war that's lasted for nearly 4 years. As Jay in Kyiv points out, the more weapons that Putin is sending to countries like Venezuela, the fewer he has to kill Ukraine's soldiers and civilians. If Wagner mercenaries are also heading to Venezuela, as seems to be the case, that means Putin is weakening Russia's position in Africa as well. Putin has lost his mind, you guys, Jay in Kyiv says. If I had to, gun to head, had to make a decision, I think that's what's going on, and that's very good. This is the end of days. This is Putin's roadmap to the end. The point Jay seems to be making is that this is Putin scrambling to hold on to whatever influence Russia still has, at a time when he has weakened that influence globally. Russia's military certainly isn't the powerhouse that Putin so long proclaimed it to be. If it were, Ukraine would be defeated by now. Instead, Russia is mired in a conflict that threatens to stretch on for many more years, with each of those years further demonstrating how weak the military that propped up Putin's ambitions for empire really is. And to make matters worse, Putin isn't even achieving the thing that he really wants to achieve with what he's doing in Venezuela. Beyond turning Maduro into a puppet, Putin wants the West to fear the prospect of Russia getting involved in the Venezuelan conflict. As if to underscore that point, Putin signed into Russian law a strategic agreement between Russia and Venezuela on October 27th, Iran press reports. That signing was purposefully delayed, as the agreement was actually drafted back in May. Putin is using the signing of the agreement to justify what he's sending to Venezuela, but it simply isn't having the desired effect. What is that effect? The US was probably supposed to send its ships back home rather than keeping them just off Venezuela's shores. That hasn't happened. The US isn't scared of Putin anymore. It realizes that a handful of weapons shipped over by a couple of cargo planes is little more than a gesture, a weak attempt by Putin to maintain control over a country that is slipping out of his grasp. And it's not even good weapons that Russia is sending to Venezuela, Jay in Kyiv points out. He notes that Russia's cargo planes stopped in several other countries, including Algeria, Morocco, Senegal, and Mauritania en route to Venezuela. They likely grabbed weapons on those stops, but those will be weapons that Putin deems not useful enough to take back for the Ukraine war. Putin is raiding the bottom of the barrel to help Maduro here, Jay says, and it's not going to be enough. How could it be? It's not like Venezuela is in a position to go to war with the US, even with Putin's help. What Putin is doing is the equivalent of shaking his fist at somebody who's holding a gun to his head. The threat isn't going to work, which is the clearest sign that the mighty has fallen and that Russia's puppet empire is crumbling. This is all very reminiscent of Syria. Russia had supported Syria in much the same way that it's now trying to support Venezuela long before Putin became president. The Soviet Union had already established itself as Syria's main military backer in the 1950s, with that relationship strengthening after some on and off periods in the 2000s, as Russia and Syria both found themselves at odds with the US. Russia ended up backing the Assad regime throughout the 2000s, essentially earning itself another puppet to which it sent far more money and weapons than it's now sending to Venezuela. But more didn't matter in the end. In late 2024, Bashar al-Assad's regime still ended up crumbling, and Putin lost a key strategic foothold in the Middle East as a result. Now, Russia is reduced to paying those who now control Syria $23 million, per the Wall Street Journal, just to keep his military bases in the country. Putin lost control of Syria even though he supported the Assad regime far more than he's supporting Maduro in Venezuela. Russia's weakening of itself in Ukraine likely played a part in Syria's fall. Now, almost a year later, Russia is weaker still as Putin attempts to secure a stronger foothold in Venezuela, even as that foothold crumbles beneath him. With Syria out of his grasp, Putin is doubling down on Russia's relationship with Iran, Jay in Kyiv explains. He says that Russia has begun pouring weapons into that country as best it can. Again, this is Putin attempting a power play for which he is no longer equipped. In the past, Russia supplying Iran with weapons would have allowed Putin more control over another puppet. Now, due to Iran playing such a pivotal role in Russia's strategy in Ukraine, thanks to its Shahid drones, it's more like Putin repaying a favor. This is all reminiscent of Hitler at the end, Jay in Kyiv says. Fantasies of a mad dictator going down. Putin thinks Russia is more powerful and influential than it really is. He is quickly finding out the truth. Still, as Putin's grip in the Middle East falters and his attempts to exert influence and threaten the US via Venezuela fail, he at least maintains influence closer to home. Belarus is still serving as the puppet that Putin always wanted it to be. The country's president, Alexander Lukashenko, served his territory up on a silver platter to Putin for the Ukraine invasion, as Belarus was used as one of the main staging grounds of the special military operation. Surely nothing could shake Putin's grip on that part of the Russian Empire? Think again. As with Venezuela, Russia's actions in Belarus seem to indicate that Putin has complete control of his Lukashenko puppet. Russia has even sent Oreshnik missiles into Belarus, which Lukashenko claims via a spokesperson that he will deploy in December. Lukashenko has also played the part of the Putin puppet well in explaining the devastating power of the missile. Jay in Kyiv shares footage from what appears to be a propaganda event in Belarus, in which the country's dictatorial president says, "The Oreshnik is a terrifying weapon. It will go on combat duty in December. I want them to understand that we can strike if things go badly. This is purely for foreign audience consumption. Then we'll sit down with Putin, make a decision and strike. So don't provoke us." That's all straight out of the Putin puppeteering playbook. Send a weapon to a puppet state and then use that state to deliver the threats that Putin wants to deliver. But as with Venezuela, peeking behind the Belarusian curtain reveals that all is not rosy in this once reliable Russian proxy state. Al Jazeera was saying as much way back in January, when it shared comments made by Radio Liberty political observer Valery Karbalovich. To an extent, he became a hostage of the system that he himself created, Karbalovich tells Al Jazeera. He couldn't leave power even when he wanted to. He's afraid for his life, for his freedom, and therefore he will hold on to his power to the end. The point here is that Lukashenko knows that he's being propped up by Putin. The problem is that Belarus is being sent into a death spiral because of its association with Russia. Lukashenko has identified this already. On October 20th, the Kyiv Independent reported that Belarus is seeking talks with Ukraine in an effort to find a consensus on how to end the war. The head of Belarus's State Security Committee, Ivan Turtle, tried to put a brave face on this move. "Our president works as much as possible in order to stabilize the situation in the region, and we've managed to balance the interests of the parties in this extremely complicated situation with a tendency towards escalation," Turtle said on Belarusian state TV. Of course, this isn't the case. Stabilization wasn't on Lukashenko's mind when he thought that Putin's forces would steamroll through Ukraine. It was only after years of Russia failing to achieve a victory through its military might that Lukashenko started making moves that could be interpreted as his attempting to cozy up to the West. That's what this statement really means. Lukashenko is trying to quietly tell the very nations that Putin wants to threaten that Belarus is ready to play ball. Whether those nations will listen is another question, but the very fact that Lukashenko is making these kinds of moves is indicative of a man who believes that the Russian president, who has so long pulled his strings, no longer has the bite to back up his bark. Belarus is now on the verge of imploding thanks to Putin's war, and Lukashenko is trying to weasel his way towards survival, as we explained in a video published about a month ago. Check out that video to learn more. However, the key takeaway here is that even one of Russia's closest allies is having second thoughts about being part of the empire that Putin is desperate to create. Whether it's Venezuela, Belarus, Syria, or even Iran, Putin's influence is unraveling. His empire is going down the drain, and the cracks are starting to show much closer to home than Putin would ever want anybody to realize. As his global grip loosens, Putin is getting even more desperate because Ukraine is one of the chief causes of his empire's downfall. And we don't just mean that in the sense that Ukraine's brave defense of its territory has revealed the true weakness of Russia's military. Ukraine has been going on the attack, and its strikes on Russia's territory have further limited Putin's ability to control his puppets. As the BBC highlighted in early October, Ukraine's strikes on Russia's oil refineries have played a pivotal role in weakening Putin's grasp on his own country. Never mind those that he's trying to turn into puppet states. By the beginning of October, Ukraine had struck 21 of Russia's 38 largest oil refineries in 2025, the BBC reports. Many of those refineries have been hit multiple times. The refinery in Russia's Saratov Oblast was hit for a third time in the fall alone on November 3rd, for example. These repeated strikes have made it extremely difficult for Russia to make repairs, which has resulted in the country experiencing mass fuel shortages. The situation has gotten so bad for Russia that it has dramatically increased its fuel imports from Belarus to try to fill in the gaps. Lukashenko will be asking himself what use being a Putin puppet is when Russia can't even sustain its own domestic gasoline demands. He, along with many other puppets that Putin wants to control, will also be asking themselves if Russia's financial muscle is weakening just as its military one is. In August, the Kyiv Independent reported that Ukraine's long-range strikes against Russia had cost Putin's country 4% of its gross domestic product. That amounts to $74.1 billion, and that figure comes from before Ukraine really ramped up its refinery strikes in August, September, and October. Russia is bleeding money thanks to Ukraine's attacks, much like its military is bleeding troops due to Ukraine's defense of its territory. Both of these issues weaken Russia, and a weakened Russia isn't able to maintain the empire that Putin is trying to build. Now, even Moscow isn't safe from Ukraine's wrath, as Ukraine has turned its attention to that city's energy infrastructure. They are going to lose their energy grid, and it's only a matter of time, Jay in Kyiv says in his video. 6 substations now hit. These are all massive substations, and the more that Ukraine hits, the more difficult it is to replace as there's more and more points of failure. Again, Putin's puppets will be asking themselves what use a puppet master who can't even protect his own country's capital can really be to them. Yes, the likes of Maduro will still beg for Russian support, but even in those cases, Putin has far too many problems going on in Ukraine and at home to offer the level of support that he would have been able to provide 5 or 10 years ago. Ultimately, everything that is happening to the Russian Empire right now is a direct result of Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. And what is Putin doing about it? He isn't looking to stop the invasion. Instead, he's sending Russia spiraling deeper toward the collapse of its empire, as he focuses on the important issues such as having singers who hurt his feelings arrested. On October 29th, NBC News reported via Reuters that a group of street musicians who went viral for singing anti-Kremlin songs had been arrested and jailed by Russia. That's how low Putin has fallen in his desperate attempts to maintain some level of control over his empire. He's failing to threaten the West, and he can no longer prop up all the regimes that serve as his puppets. But hey, at least a few dangerous musicians have been taken off the Russian streets. As his puppet regimes collapse all around him, Putin is having to face up to a brutal truth. He's finished. Every time Russia feels as though it's starting to gain a foothold in the war, Ukraine comes up with something new. Innovation lies at the heart of Ukraine's asymmetric warfare campaign, and it's Russia's soldiers, equipment, and logistical infrastructure that continue to pay the price. In November, Ukraine hit Russia with a doozy. Ukraine's deadly new weapon ignites chaos behind Russian lines, and it does it by giving Ukraine a drone that allows it to cover the mid-range regions of the war that Ukraine hadn't been able to hit before. That new drone is the FP2, and as United 24 media reports, it was brought to Ukraine by Firepoint. They're the same technical minds who have developed the Flamingo missile that Ukraine is now using to hit Russia hard at range. While the Flamingo is designed to pack a far heavier explosive punch than the long-range drones Ukraine has used against Russia during the war, the FP2 is designed to offer a similar level of heavy firepower while dealing with targets Ukraine previously wasn't able to strike that lie behind the combat lines. United 24 media provides the new drone's basic specifications. It says that a single FP2 can carry a payload weighing up to 105 kilograms, which is roughly equivalent to 231 pounds. That alone makes the drone a terrifying prospect for Russia's forces. The sheer size of the FP2's payload is anywhere between 10 and 20 times that of a regular first-person view or FPV drone, which hints at the FP2 is a drone designed to hit heavier targets than tanks and armored vehicles. Ukraine's Security Service, or SBU, says as much, as it notes that it's able to use the FP2 to hit locations that Russia uses for logistics, supply coordination, and troop deployment. But we'll get back to how Ukraine is using this new drone in a moment. The FP2's other big advantage over the majority of the short-range drones Ukraine currently deploys is that it has a range of about 200 kilometers, or approximately 124 miles. That gives Ukraine options. No longer limited by the short range of its FPV drones, Ukraine can use FP2s to do serious damage along the combat lines, as well as to penetrate them deeply enough for positions Russia thought were safe to come under threat. Interestingly, this 200-kilometer range is actually a 1,200-kilometer downgrade from the FP1, which Firepoint developed to provide Ukraine with another option for striking Russia itself. The range trade-off allows the FP2 to pack a much heavier warhead than the FP1. Plus, again, it's all about options. Now, Ukraine has the FP-1 and other long-range drones and missiles it can use to hit Russia, the FP-2 for mid-range strikes, and FPV drones it can use to patrol the combat lines. That's terrifying to Russia. Ukraine now has a layered drone offense that can pick off almost any target. RBC Ukraine offers a few more details about Ukraine's new drone. It says that Firepoint has made it available in 2 variants. The first is an FP-2 that features an autonomous guidance system which is ideal for dealing with stationary targets. All Ukraine has to do is set the coordinates and the drone guides itself to the strike zone. As for the second variant, this allows manual control of the FP-2 via a radio link, making it similar to an FPV drone. A Ukrainian drone operator can use this radio link to guide their FP-2 onto a moving target or to ensure a direct hit is scored against a stationary target that might be too difficult for the first variant to reach. We've already said it a couple of times, options. RBC Ukraine also adds that the FP-2 has a very similar architecture to the FP-1 we mentioned, which is another huge plus for Ukraine. Firepoint has already moved the FP-1 into mass production. Standardization of that production already exists, so it doesn't take much for the manufacturer to apply the same standards to its FP-2 development. The upshot here is that Firepoint can build its brand new FP-2 drones at an accelerated rate, which is why we're already starting to see them being used on the battlefield. Writing for his Medium column, Ryder Blackthorn adds that Firepoint has already designed mobile setups configured to look like military trucks. These allow for quick deployment anywhere across or behind the front lines inside Ukraine, so the FP-2 is already mobile thanks to its strong range. These trucks enhance that mobility by allowing Ukraine's operators to drive as close as they dare to the Russian target before unleashing their FP-2s. Frankly, Ukraine has just received a killer drone against which Russia has almost no defense. Or as Blackthorn puts it, the FP-2 is a battlefield brawler, not a long-range assassin like the FP-1, but exactly what you want when the enemy's dug in and you need to hit hard, hit fast, and keep moving. Blackthorn also notes that the FP-2 is exactly the right drone arriving at the right time for Ukraine. Coming back to the range, he says that losing 1,200 kilometers from the FP-1 is barely even a sacrifice because Ukraine already has plenty of drones that are capable of traveling that far or deeper into Russian territory. What Ukraine needed was a drone that could hit targets a couple of 100 kilometers deep into occupied Ukraine. FP-2 fills that need. Russia will be wary of the amount of damage such a powerful drone could cause. However, it may want to soothe itself with the belief that such a strong drone must surely cost Firepoint a bundle to build. That belief is mistaken. Perhaps the most important attribute of the FP-2, beyond even its range and firepower, is its price. The drone costs just $55,000 to build. This is a drone that packs as much firepower as many missiles, and yet it costs a fraction of the amount to build. That's huge for Ukraine, because the war against Russia has been very costly. For as well as Ukraine has defended itself, a major toll has been taken on the country's economy. Responsible Statecraft highlighted this monetary issue in a March article. It claimed that Ukraine could wind up broke even if the war ended back in March, suggesting that the country is in financial peril. To balance the books in 2026, it added, Ukraine would have to cut its military budget by 80% to make a $41 billion saving. There may be other options. For instance, The Guardian reports that the European Union is looking into using Russia's frozen assets to provide a substantial loan to Ukraine that could be as much as $157.5 billion over the next few years. However, that proposal is still in the works and there are no guarantees that such a loan is forthcoming. For Ukraine, building a new drone that can hit as hard as the FP-2 for as little as that drone costs is essential for bringing down its defense budget at a time when the entire country may face financial problems. There's another side to this low-cost coin, however. While Ukraine obviously benefits from building such cheap yet effective weapons, Russia also suffers mightily. That's according to the Lowy Institute's David Kirichenko, who wrote an article in June highlighting how Ukraine's cheap drones have already exacted a heavy financial price from Russia. He highlighted the devastating Operation Spiderweb, which saw Ukraine sneak low-cost FPV drones into Russia on the back of trucks. Those drones were unleashed on several Russian airfields, causing an estimated $7 billion in damage, while disabling up to a third of Russia's strategic bomber fleet. While Ukraine hasn't spoken about the cost of this operation, the FPV drones it used can cost as little as $400 per unit. As Kirichenko put it, drones each worth a couple of $100 remotely launched from a cargo container inflicted billions in damages against Russia. A foreign adversary with far more resources could seek to replicate Kyiv's innovations in the future, with chatter already spreading about the potential danger from Chinese cargo ships. The adversaries with large pockets are future problems for Russia. But right now, it's dealing with a version of Ukraine that can cost Russia millions or even billions of dollars with the use of drones that only cost thousands of dollars to build. Don't underestimate how important this cost-effectiveness is for Ukraine. After all, Russia isn't immune to economic issues of its own. Putin has spent hundreds of billions of dollars on his supposed special military operation, and he has taken Russia's economy to the brink of destruction to do so. Back in September, the Russian Minister of Economic Development, Maxim Reshetnikov, noted that Russia is going to struggle to maintain its current level of war spending. The numbers show the Russian economy is cooling off, Reshetnikov said during an economic conference held in St. Petersburg in June. Judging by business sentiment at the moment, Russia is basically already on the brink of falling into a recession. That seems to be a warning that Putin isn't heeding. He claims that Russia tumbling to around the 1% gross domestic product growth mark in 2025 from the over 4% growth seen in 2024 is all part of the plan, somehow. It isn't. Putin is lying through his teeth to justify his insane Ukraine war spending. Ukraine can take advantage of this with weapons like the FP2 by using its drones to continue taking out valuable Russian military assets at a fraction of the cost of those assets. As Russia continues to run full steam ahead into an economic meltdown of its own, it may soon no longer be able to afford to replace those assets. Oh, and one last thing about the FP2, it's just as capable of hitting Russian targets at night as it is of taking them out during the light of day. And that brings us nicely to how Ukraine has already started using its new drone to ignite chaos behind the Russian front lines. After all, the impressive specifications wouldn't mean much if Ukraine wasn't able to prove that the FP2 is combat ready. But it has, several times, as United 24 media reports. On November 2nd, that outlet reported that the SBU had carried out a series of precision strikes using FP2 drones. All of these strikes took place in occupied areas of Ukraine, suggesting that Ukraine had sent its new drones behind the combat lines. The targets, United 24 media says, were several military warehouses and bases that Russia is using to both coordinate and supply the soldiers fighting against Ukraine stationed miles away. The SBU itself provided more details in a Telegram post published on November 2nd. Alpha Special Forces of the Security Service of Ukraine carried out a series of precision strikes on enemy positions in temporarily occupied territories, the SBU declared. The locations of accumulation of equipment and personnel used for logistics and distribution of enemy forces were hit. It should come as no surprise that the Alpha Special Forces were chosen for one of the first uses of the FP2 on the battlefield. Considered one of the top divisions of Ukraine's special forces, the Alpha Group is involved in everything from asymmetric warfare and the capture of high-value targets to black operations and long-range strikes against Ukraine's enemies. It's something of a jack-of-all special forces trades, and it has proven its effectiveness from the moment that Putin invaded Ukraine. It was the Alpha Special Forces that destroyed a convoy filled with Chechen paramilitary forces heading toward Kyiv during the first few days of the invasion. The group has also been heavily involved in the battle for Kharkiv, and it's captured several spies, infiltrators, and Russian sympathizers during the course of the war. This is a group that's capable of getting almost any job done, making it the perfect choice for showcasing what Ukraine's new FP2 drones can do. Russia can't even deny that these strikes happened. The SBU posted footage to show what Ukraine did with its new drones. The video showcases multiple targets being hit, presumably by the drones. Some of the footage appears to have been shot by the FP2s themselves as they approach their targets, suggesting that the drones have similar capabilities to FPV drones in that regard. Perhaps these were the versions of the drone that Ukraine controlled manually. Regardless, the footage showcases several large explosions that highlight the power being delivered by the FP2. And almost all of the targets are buildings that Ukraine may have struggled to damage with its short-range and less powerful FPV drones. And Ukraine wasn't done there. On November 3rd, Euromaidan Press reported that the SBU had sparked yet more chaos behind Russia's front lines with another series of strikes. We have more information about these attacks than we do about the November 2nd strikes, especially when it comes to locations. On November 3rd, Ukraine hit a pair of logistical facilities in Luhansk, both of which are regularly used by Russia's troops, Euromaidan Press says. Ukraine's special forces took to Telegram to provide more information about this pair of strikes, stating, "Near the city of Dovzhansk, a place for unloading fuel and lubricants was hit by fire. Near the village of Roskishna, one of the SOF units destroyed a warehouse for the logistical support of the occupation forces." The same post noted that disruption was Ukraine's plan with the November 3rd strike. In addition to making it more difficult for Russia to get much-needed supplies to its frontline troops, the FP2s also took out fuel intended for the center grouping of Russian soldiers. Ukraine is being clever here. Rather than allowing Russia to deploy its troops at as close to full strength as possible, Ukraine is focusing on the supply lines that feed those soldiers. Granted, this means that Ukraine still has to destroy Russia's assaults as and when they're launched, but the soldiers Ukraine is fighting have less equipment, fuel, and other supplies, making them much easier targets for Ukraine's FPV drones. This is the multi-layered drone offensive we mentioned earlier. Ukraine uses FP2 drones to weaken Russia from the rear, before using FPV drones to take out the Russian soldiers who no longer benefit from the logistical network built up behind them. Euromaidan Press adds that the Dovzhansk strike occurred about 150 kilometers or about 93 miles behind the front lines, so Ukraine is already taking advantage of the range of its FP2s to do plenty of damage. As for the Roshkizhna strike, it took place in a Luhansk suburb that is around 90 kilometers or about 56 miles behind the combat lines. As with the November 2nd strikes, there is also footage. What we see is much the same on November 3rd. Footage shot from the drones that Ukraine used shows them approaching their targets before scoring direct hits. We don't get to see explosions this time, suggesting that Ukraine didn't have the reconnaissance drones recording what it was doing in Luhansk. Still, it doesn't matter. We see what's happening from the FP2's perspectives, which is all the proof needed to demonstrate that Ukraine scored direct hits with its new drones. Russia should be worried. The FP2 has been let loose and it's already causing far more damage than its $55,000 price tag suggests it should be able to cause. However, Russia shouldn't just be worried about this specific drone. What the FP2 shows us, perhaps more than anything else, is that Ukraine is constantly adapting its drone strategy to account for Russia's tactics. Dealing with the Russian mid-range was a problem for Ukraine, with the FP2 providing the solution. But this innovative drone is far from the only thing that Ukraine is bringing to the table as the war with Russia marches into 2026. Take gamification, for instance. On November 3rd, The Guardian published a report claiming that Ukraine has created a video game-like reward system for its drone operators. The system, which was launched at some point in 2024, rewards soldiers with points that they can use to buy more drones and weapons from an online store named Brave One. There are over 100 drones and autonomous vehicles available via the store, suggesting that Ukraine's drone operators are using the game their country has created to upgrade their equipment. The approach is working, as The Guardian says. Drone teams competing for points under the Army of Drones bonus system killed or wounded 18,000 Russian soldiers in September, with 400 drone units now taking part in the competition, up from 95 in August. The very idea conjures up images of Ukraine's drone operators conducting the war as though they're playing a game of Call of Duty. It may seem grim to some, but the gamification of drone warfare offers an incentive to these operators to destroy more Russian troops and equipment. Perhaps the game provides a sort of levity for an otherwise brutal task. Whatever the case may be, Russia should be very concerned about the sheer number of soldiers it lost in a single month to players of Ukraine's new drone game. Other Ukrainian innovations include the use of drones to create a multi-layered defense, much like the multi-layered offense to which the FP2 now contributes. UKR Inform spoke about this new defensive approach in an article where it quoted Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, Oleksandr Syrskyi. Writing on Facebook, Syrskyi said, "We are creating a layered system to counter enemy Shahids and Gerants. Our joint task is to form more crews, train more interceptor operators, and provide them with more effective strike systems and radars. It's drones upon drones." And whether Russia is attacking or defending, it seems that it no longer has any escape from Ukraine's aerial menaces. If these multi-layered defenses work in tandem with the FP2 and Ukraine's FPV drones, then Russia is in serious trouble. Ukraine can assault its troops behind the combat lines with FP2s, use FPV drones to shred soldiers on the front lines, and snuff out attempted advances with layers of drone defenses it's built up.
Vladimir Putin's Federal Security Service, FSB, is one of the most feared intelligence agencies in the world, renowned for its ruthless tactics and powerful political influence. But it just got played by Andrei, a Ukrainian double agent who humiliated the agency with a truly genius trap it never saw coming. It's a story that sounds like it was plucked from the pages of a spy novel or stolen from a screenplay about subterfuge, secret agents and sabotage. But it's all true, and here's a full detailed breakdown of how it happened. Now, years before the war began, Andrei was a successful businessman. He ran his own hotel in the Crimean Peninsula, and through hard work, dedication and shrewd business sense, earned himself a small fortune. Then Russia took it all away, not just once, but twice. First, when the Kremlin's invaders came to Crimea in 2014, they forcefully expropriated Andrei's hotel, essentially snatching his livelihood out of his hands. He managed to recover and was running another company in 2022 when the full-scale invasion began. Again, Russian soldiers interfered in Andrei's world, looting valuable building materials from his firm and leaving him wondering what to do with his life next. Understandably, he also harbored a deep sense of resentment for the Russian invaders and hoped to someday have a chance to exact his revenge upon them. At the time, Andrei had contacts in the security service of Ukraine and kept in touch with them as the war progressed, just in case there was anything he could help out with. Eventually, the opportunity he'd been waiting for presented itself. A problem arose in Andrei's local city. Agents had been hired by Russia's FSB in order to blow up administrative buildings. The SBU needed a way to counter their operations, and Andrei decided to lend a hand, working together with SBU operatives to set traps for FSB agents, and if all went to plan, capture some of them as well. It was suspected that Russia's agents were using social media platforms as recruitment tools, posting ads online and targeting desperate men with little money. So Andrei began scouring those same social media platforms in search of a way into the FSB circles. He soon found some of the FSB ads and started to understand how they operated. He learned that they would begin by offering relatively trivial, basic jobs on social media, like spray painting Nazi symbols on the sides of buildings or defacing public property with logos of Ukrainian national groups. Once an agent proved their worth with these relatively low-level tasks, they'd be able to work their way up the ranks, gaining more responsibility and being entrusted with more challenging and dangerous missions, like arson, with much higher payments for their services. Thanks to his background in business and negotiation, Andrei was able to skip the low-level grunt work, reaching out to the Russians and convincing them that he wasn't interested in any tasks for urban teenagers, as he recently put it to the Telegraph, demanding to move directly onto the more high-end, high-paying roles. The Russians soon grew to trust him and eventually awarded him his biggest and most dangerous task yet. He was ordered to build an improvised explosive device and use it to blow up an administrative building in a city in southern Ukraine. Andrei agreed, but of course, he had no actual intention of destroying anything or hurting any of his fellow Ukrainians. Still, he had to play the part in order to set his trap and lure a real Russian agent into it. So after receiving detailed instructions from the FSB operatives, including a detailed list of all the ingredients and components he needed to make the bomb, he got to work. He went out to a local market to purchase the necessary items, then followed his handler's comments to the letter, even buying and installing ball bearings to help increase the destructive potential and lethal capacities of his homemade bomb. A Russian Special Services officer kept close tabs on him as he worked, making sure he made no mistakes and omitted no steps or components while crafting the explosive. What the Russian officer didn't know, however, was that Andrei was secretly making a second false bomb filled with harmless flour, but designed to look exactly the same as the real thing. His plan was to swap the bombs when the moment came, ensuring that nobody got hurt and the Russians were left with egg, or in this case flour, all over their faces. But there were several big obstacles in Andrei's way. First, there was always the risk of getting caught, either by the Russians themselves, who might decide to pay Andrei a visit to ensure he was following through on their orders, or by Ukrainian law enforcement, who could easily assume he was a real Russian agent and arrest him. If that happened, Andrei was confident that his connections in the SBU could help him avoid any further punishment, but it would still disrupt his secret scheme. Plus, if there were any Russian agents or traitors among the local law enforcement, they could have tipped the FSB off, as Andrei explained in an interview with the Telegraph. After one call to an SBU officer, they would have come and sorted everything out. The problem was something else, a possible traitor serving at the checkpoint who could stop me. He could recognize me, tell the Russians about me, and I'd never be able to participate again. I'd be like a spent cartridge. If that happened, Andrei would have found it almost impossible to get work from the Russians ever again, and Ukraine would have lost one of its most effective and important double agents. Fortunately, it didn't happen. Andrei was able to complete the first part of his mission in secret, avoiding detection from those on both sides of the divide and keeping both of his improvised explosives hidden at his home. Then, however, he faced another challenge. The ultimate goal of his plan was to lay a trap and help Ukraine's SBU capture one or more of Russia's agents. But that wouldn't happen if he were the only one involved in both making the bomb and then planting it at the target location in the city. He needed to get someone else involved, a real Russian agent, someone who was loyal to the Kremlin cause and willing to hurt or even kill their fellow countrymen just for a quick cash payout. For that to happen, he had a big task ahead of him. He had to convince his FSB handler that while he may have been able to build the bomb, he wasn't ready to actually plant it. Once more, for this part of the operation, Andrei had to rely on his powers of persuasion, bringing out his inner businessman all over again and crafting a narrative strong enough to convince the Russian officer to bring in a third party. It took over a week. During that time, Andrei pleaded with the FSB officer not to make him plant the bomb. He knew that the explosion was intended to kill several dozen employees at the administrative building, but claimed he was not ready to get blood on his hands. He also professed plenty of false support and admiration for Russia, convincing the officer that he was loyal to the Kremlin and wanted to play his part, but that he just wasn't quite at the point of being able to kill people. It takes a lot to convince an FSB officer to change their mind or adjust their plans. These are people who are infamous for their brutality, carrying out Kremlin orders no matter the cost, with almost zero regard for the sanctity of life, and no interest in anything apart from robotically achieving their existing objective and moving on to the next. Very few people would even dare to try and argue with one of these officers, and even fewer would have succeeded without arousing at least some sort of suspicion or losing the trust of their handler in the process. But somehow, Andrei pulled it off. He convinced the FSB officer to bring in an additional agent and make some changes to their pre-existing plan. Now, instead of Andrei having to both make the bomb and plant it at the target building, he would simply need to hide it in a designated location. Another agent would then come along to collect the concealed package and deliver it the final miles to the target. That's exactly what happened. Andrei hid his bomb and texted the location to his handler. The Russians passed this information on to another of their trustees who arrived at the site to pick up the explosive. But there were two things the trustee didn't know. First, he had no idea that the bomb he collected was completely inoffensive, filled not with explosives and incendiaries, but a harmless kitchen staple. He thought he was carrying an improvised explosive device powerful enough to end the lives of dozens of people. In reality, it was little more than a glorified container of flour. Second, and most importantly, the agent was wholly unaware that from the moment he arrived at the pickup site, he came under immediate and constant surveillance by Ukraine's SBU agents. They followed his every move from that point on, tracking him as he followed his handler's orders, taking the bomb all the way to the very doorstep of the administrative building he was supposed to destroy. At that point, Ukraine's agents moved in for the capture, springing Andrei's perfectly planned and flawlessly executed trap and taking the trustee into custody. According to a follow-up report from the agency, the perpetrator was discovered to be an unemployed resident living in the Ukrainian city of Ternopil in the western region of the same name. Like so many other people who are desperate for money and willing to do almost anything to earn it, he came across some of the FSB's ads on Telegram channels and decided to sign up and offer his services. As with other recruits, he was first given trivial test tasks in his local area and reportedly set fire to some Ukrainian railway facilities in his hometown before earning the right to participate in a terrorist attack. Fortunately for his would-be victims, this trustee teamed up with the wrong partner. Thanks to Andrei's actions, he's now behind bars, without the right to bail, and facing the very real possibility of life imprisonment plus confiscation of property for numerous offences under the Criminal Code of Ukraine. Those offences include sabotage committed under martial law, as well as an attempted terrorist attack. His bad decisions have left him in a world of trouble, with very little hope for any sort of future. Andrei, meanwhile, has the immense satisfaction of knowing he played his part in saving lives and humiliating the FSB all at once. You get great moral satisfaction when people could have died, but you distracted the attention of that rotten Russian office and used their resources. He's a true hero, and he has no intention of stopping his heroic acts anytime soon. Andrei continues to scour social media, flicking through job offers on his phone on a regular basis, eagerly awaiting his next opportunity to plan a trap and play the Russians at their own game. He encounters all sorts of proposals from FSB agents. Some are quite basic, like the aforementioned graffiti and vandalism jobs. These tend to pay only small amounts, though prices have risen in recent times as Russia attempts to ramp up its sabotage operations across Ukrainian territories in order to disrupt the country's society and sow seeds of corruption and confusion among its communities. Andrei notes, they used to pay $3 per piece, but now the price has gone up. He also explains how these jobs work. First, an agent has to draw or paint the requested symbols, which might include swastikas or nationalist logos, on city walls or other locations selected by the Russians. Then they have to take photographs of their work and post them on a fake Ukrainian nationalist website created by Russia's intelligence agencies. Some of the tasks, however, are much more serious, with far graver consequences for all involved. And the FSB's adverts are often designed to be eye-catching and appealing for those in need of money fast. One ad, for example, begins with the headline, "Are you looking for a job with a flexible schedule and decent pay?" It goes on to introduce the type of work required. Arson attacks on government buildings and draft offices across Ukraine. Then it lists a number of perks citing privacy, professional instruction, 24/7 support, and a high salary ranging from $1,000 to $5,000 for a single project as just some of the benefits. The post also notes that payment can be made via various means, including conventional card payments or cryptocurrencies, which are well known for being much more private and harder to track. The ad then goes to explain what's expected of the applicant, listing a series of possible targets for their arson attacks alongside the average payment for each one. An arson attack on a prosecutor's office, for example, is priced at $3,000, while post office attacks are $1,000 and SBU buildings earn the highest payment of $5,000. Other viable targets included in the list are police buildings, border control buildings, court buildings, draft offices, tax offices, and correctional facilities. The ad encourages applicants to share names and numbers of other people they feel could carry out these kinds of attacks, with the promise of a commission for every successful referral. Other ads strike a similar tone, with images of flames, dollar signs, and Ukrainian flags, coupled with headline messages like, "If you're brave and energetic, we have a job for you. You'll work for a few hours a day." The Kremlin is even said to be using drones to drop leaflets and paper ads in Ukrainian towns and cities in order to reach even more people and acquire more operatives, often focusing on impoverished areas where locals are more likely to be desperate and willing to turn against their own people for personal profit. It's all part of a pernicious Kremlin plan to create the illusion of some sort of resistance movement in Ukraine. If the FSB can recruit enough people to carry out arson attacks, spread Ukrainian nationalist iconography, and even commit terrorism, it paints a picture of a country at war with itself, a country crumbling from within with its own people turning against it. This in turn provides some sort of justification for the Kremlin's continued attacks and incursions, lending credence to Putin's proclamations about Russian forces being dispatched to denazify Ukraine's territories. The Kremlin also undoubtedly hopes that Ukraine's Western allies may hear reports of homemade bombs and Ukrainian citizens committing terrorism against their own local governments and administrative buildings and gradually become less supportive of Kyiv as a result. Fortunately, most of the world can see exactly what's happening here, since they're perfectly familiar with the FSB's underhanded tactics. It's also encouraging to see that there are brave souls like Andrei who are willing to turn the tables on the Kremlin's intelligence agency. He's just one of numerous Ukrainian double agents doing their bit for the greater good, quite literally helping to save lives, catch terrorists, and foil the plans of their oppressors on a regular basis. And Andrei is proud of the work he does and the difference he makes. He does it all out of love for his country and his family, and was also driven to join the cause by the personal injustices he himself suffered at the hands of Russian occupiers in the past. At first, my friends who had left Ukraine asked me who had ordered me to start this activity. I could never understand that question. I'm doing this on my own free will because I fear for my family and my life since the enemy has invaded our land. In working with the FSB, Andrei has also learned a lot about how they operate and has been able to pass on invaluable intelligence to his contacts at the SBU. He states that many of the Russian agents he interacts with are generally quite competent, but often tend to have distorted views of what life in Ukraine is really like. They may suggest drawing Nazi symbols next to a river, for example, despite the fact that almost no people ever actually walk in that area due to the frequent presence of Russian drones buzzing overhead. They also make other foolish requests, like asking agents to go to local markets in search of explosive components. Sometimes I had the feeling that FSB officers formed their impressions of the realities of our lives here not based on in-depth research and intelligence data, but as if they watched a low-budget action film or the news that covers Ukraine on Russian television. Sadly, not everyone is as brave and honorable as Andrei. There are some Ukrainians who willingly oblige with Russian demands. Often, this is simply due to their personal situations, with little money and few prospects of future success, making them feel that they have no other options. Other times, they may feel sympathy for the Kremlin's cause, having family ties to Russia, or just have some sort of violent or reckless streak within them, so jump at the opportunity to commit criminal acts. These are the kinds of people that the FSB will continue to target, but with Ukraine's own intelligence services and inspiring double agents like Andrei standing in the way, the Kremlin isn't going to find it easy to organize their attacks and achieve their objectives. Now, learn more about how Ukraine is using sabotage and shadow tactics to cripple the Kremlin's operations from inside Russia in this video. Or for another true tale of Ukrainian revenge against Russian war criminals, watch this video, which looks at how Kyiv's forces recently orchestrated an almost impossible assassination of one of the Kremlin's most heartless commanders. And finally, be sure to subscribe to our channel as well, to stay informed and up to date on all the latest news and major developments from the front lines of Ukraine and beyond.